Mason Blackwood squinted through his binoculars from the watchtower. Something wasn't right. The massive Brahman bull, all 1,900 pounds of rippling muscle and steel-gray hide, paced anxiously along the fence line. In 15 years as a Texas wildlife ranger, Mason had never seen anything like it. The bull's scarred face turned toward him, intelligent eyes locking onto Mason's with an intensity that sent a shiver down his spine. Then it bellowed, a sound so deliberate it felt like language. Mason's grandfather's voice echoed in his mind. "When cattle come calling, best pay attention, son. They don't waste breath like people do." As Mason grabbed his gear, the old Texas sun beat down mercilessly on his weathered neck. What I didn't know then was that I had exactly 24 hours to save 2 lives, and that before the day was done, that bull would save mine. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. The ground beneath Mason's boots cracked like brittle bones as he followed the bull into the rugged Texas backcountry. July had been cruel this year. 3 weeks without rain had scorched the land golden brown, leaving only the hardiest mesquite and prickly pear to dot the unforgiving landscape. The air shimmered with heat, making the distant hills dance like mirages. "Easy there, big fella," Mason called, his voice rough from years of dust and desert air. The bull, an impressive specimen even by Brahman standards, kept a steady pace ahead, stopping occasionally to look back as if making sure Mason was still following. There was something familiar about this animal. The distinctive scar running across its right eye triggered a memory Mason couldn't quite place, like a photograph faded by too many years in the sun. He'd worked this land for nearly 2 decades, watched generations of wildlife come and go. But this bull, there was something different in those eyes. Mason's radio crackled. "Base to Blackwood. What's your position?" Director Harrington's voice, perpetually annoyed. "Following a distressed Brahman bull into the southeast quadrant," Mason replied. "Something's wrong." "A bull? Jesus, Mason. We've got reports of poachers near the north fence and you're chasing cattle?" Mason watched the bull pause atop a ridge, its massive head swinging back impatiently. "This isn't random, sir. This animal is trying to show me something." Harrington's sigh crackled through the speaker. "You and your damn animal whispering. 1 hour, Blackwood, then I need you back at North Fence." Mason clipped the radio back to his belt, remembering the day 7 years ago when he'd found a Brahman calf nuzzling its slaughtered mother. The poachers had taken the horns and left the rest to the vultures. He'd carried that trembling calf 3 miles back to the station. The bull led him down into a dry creek bed where the gnarled roots of ancient cottonwoods twisted above the parched earth. Then suddenly it stopped, pawing the ground and letting out a low, mournful sound that raised the hair on Mason's arms. That's when he saw her. A Brahman cow lay on her side, entangled in barbed wire that cut deep into her flesh. Blood, both dried and fresh, matted her coat. But what made Mason's breath catch was her swollen belly. She was heavily pregnant. "Oh, God," he whispered, approaching slowly. The cow's eyes rolled white with pain and fear. The bull stood protective nearby, watching Mason with what could only be described as desperate hope. Mason knelt beside her, carefully assessing the damage. The barbed wire had wrapped around her multiple times, each movement driving the cruel barbs deeper. And something wasn't right about the placement. This wasn't accidental. Someone had deliberately set this trap. Mason reached for his radio. "Blackwood to base. I need Dr. Reynolds and the emergency vet team at my location immediately. Pregnant Brahman cow, severe barbed wire injuries, possible labor." As he waited for a response, the bull moved closer, its breath warm against Mason's neck. 24 hours, Dr. Reynolds would later tell him after examining the cow they'd named Belle. "We have 24 hours to save them both." The clock had started ticking. 7 years earlier, Mason had been patrolling the eastern boundary of the reserve when he first heard it, a sound so plaintive it seemed to carry the weight of all suffering. Following the cries, he'd discovered a scene that would haunt him for years. A magnificent Brahman cow, her white coat now crimson, lay butchered on the dusty ground. Her horns had been crudely hacked off, leaving splintered bone exposed to the merciless Texas sun. Beside her, trembling on spindly legs, stood a bull calf no more than 2 weeks old. "Goddamn poachers," Mason had muttered, his fists clenching in rage. The calf, terrified but defiant, had backed away as Mason approached, letting out a pitiful attempt at a threatening bellow that broke Mason's heart. "Easy now," he'd whispered, removing his ranger hat slowly. "I'm not here to hurt you." The afternoon stretched long as Mason sat motionless, speaking in soft tones until the exhausted calf finally allowed him close enough to touch its quivering flank. When Mason finally lifted the calf into his arms, it had gone limp with exhaustion. The drive back to the ranger station seemed endless, the small creature's heartbeat fluttering against Mason's chest like a frightened bird. Sarah had been waiting on the porch of their cabin when he pulled up. 7 months pregnant, her sundress stretched tight across her swollen belly. She'd gasped at the sight of the orphaned calf. "Oh, Mason," she'd whispered, her hands automatically cradling her own unborn child. "The poor baby." That night, they'd transformed their tool shed into a makeshift nursery. Sarah, despite Mason's protests about her condition, had stayed up through the night, bottle-feeding the calf warm milk every few hours. "I'm pregnant, not invalid," she'd told him with that smile that always melted his objections. "Besides, he needs a mother." They'd named him Titan for the fight in his eyes despite all he'd lost. During those weeks, something magical happened in their little cabin at the edge of the reserve. Sarah would sit reading aloud to her unborn child, and Titan would rest his head in her lap as if listening to stories meant for another baby entirely. "He knows," Sarah had said one evening, her hand guiding Mason's to feel their child kicking. "Animals understand more than we give them credit for." Mason remembered how she'd looked in the golden hour light streaming through the window, her chestnut hair illuminated like a halo, her face serene as she'd stroked Titan's head. "Our boys will grow up together," she'd said, and Mason had believed her, believed in the future painted in her words. The memory twisted like a knife in Mason's chest as he watched Dr. Reynolds and her team work frantically on Belle in the present day. The pregnant cow lay sedated on a tarp beneath a hastily erected canopy, her breathing labored as the veterinarians carefully removed strands of barbed wire from her flesh. Titan, for Mason was now certain this was the same bull he'd rescued all those years ago, paced nervously at the perimeter, refusing to leave despite the commotion. Mason's mind drifted back to the day everything changed. He'd been called away to handle an emergency on the North Ridge. Reports of armed poachers had required all available rangers. Sarah had insisted she would be fine. "Go protect your wilderness," she'd said, kissing him goodbye. "Titan and I will be waiting when you get back." The call had come 3 hours later. A truck had swerved to avoid a deer on the narrow road leading to their cabin. Sarah had been driving into town for her prenatal checkup. The impact had sent her car rolling down the embankment. By the time Mason reached the hospital, it was too late. Sarah was gone, their unborn son with her. In the days that followed, Mason moved through life like a ghost. The cabin, once filled with Sarah's laughter and plans for their future, became a mausoleum of what might have been. The only thing that pulled him from the depths of his grief was Titan. The calf still needed him. For 3 months, Mason poured all his broken love into raising the young bull. Each bottle, each gentle brushing of the growing calf's coat became an act of devotion to Sarah's memory. On what would have been their son's due date, Mason had sat in the nursery they'd prepared, untouched since Sarah's death, with Titan's head in his lap, and finally allowed himself to weep. "You're getting too big for this place," Mason had told Titan when the bull reached 6 months old. The truth was, everything reminded him of Sarah, even the calf she had loved so dearly. The day Mason released Titan back into the wild remained etched in his memory with painful clarity. They'd driven to a remote section of the reserve where a small herd of Brahman cattle grazed peacefully. Mason had opened the trailer gate, but Titan had hesitated, looking back at the man who had become his surrogate parent. "Go on now," Mason had urged, his voice thick. "This is where you belong." When Titan finally trotted toward the herd, stopping once to look back, Mason had made a silent promise to Sarah. He would protect this land and its creatures with everything he had left. It was the only way he knew to honor her memory. Now, watching Dr. Reynolds stitch Belle's wounds, Mason felt the weight of that promise anew. The parallels were too stark to ignore. Another mother, another unborn life hanging in the balance. But this time, he wouldn't fail them. "How's she doing?" Mason asked, approaching the veterinary team. "Doctor." Reynolds looked up, wiping sweat from her brow with her forearm. "She's fighter. The barbed wire missed any major arteries, thank God, but she's lost a lot of blood and there's infection setting in." She nodded toward Belle's swollen belly. "The calf seems stable for now, but this stress could trigger early labor. If that happens before we get the infection under control." She didn't need to finish the sentence. Mason understood the stakes all too well. "We've got her on antibiotics and fluids," Dr. Reynolds continued. "The next 12 hours will be critical." Mason nodded, his gaze drifting to where Titan stood vigilant. "And him? Will he be a problem?" Dr. Reynolds followed his gaze. "Strangest thing I've ever seen. He should be agitated with all of us around his cow, but it's almost like he knows we're trying to help." She tilted her head. "Actually, he reminds me of that orphaned calf you brought in years back." "Whatever happened to him?" "I released him," Mason said quietly. "After Sarah died." Understanding softened the veterinarian's features. "I'm sorry, Mason. I shouldn't have brought it up." "No, it's fine." Mason squinted at Titan, studying the distinctive scar across his right eye. "In fact, I think that might be him. After 7 years, that's unlikely," Dr. Reynolds said skeptically. But Mason knew. Something in those intelligent eyes recognized him, held a history that couldn't be explained by science or probability. This bull had sought him out specifically, had led him directly to Belle. There was a debt being repaid here, a circle being completed. As the medical team continued their work, Mason approached Titan slowly. The massive bull watched him come, neither retreating nor showing aggression. "It is you, isn't it?" Mason said softly. "You remembered." Titan lowered his great head, and for a brief moment rested it against Mason's chest, just as he had done as a calf. In that moment, Mason felt Sarah's presence more strongly than he had in years. "I won't let her down," Mason whispered, as much to Sarah's memory as to the bull before him. "I won't let either of them down. Not this time." Behind them, Belle let out a low moan of pain, and Titan's head snapped up. The clock was ticking, and Mason knew that saving this mother and her unborn calf had become more than just another rescue. It was his chance at redemption. The makeshift veterinary station hummed with urgent activity as the Texas sun climbed higher in the cloudless sky. Dr. Reynolds had called in her entire team, 3 veterinary technicians and a second veterinarian specializing in large cattle, all working in coordinated precision around Belle's massive form. The sedated cow's breathing had stabilized, but her temperature was rising steadily, a telltale sign of infection taking hold. Mason stood just outside the shade canopy, dividing his attention between the medical team and Titan, who remained a steadfast sentinel 30 yards away. The bull hadn't moved, hadn't grazed, hadn't even approached the water Mason had set out. His focus remained entirely on Belle. "We've removed all the barbed wire," Dr. Reynolds reported, approaching Mason with gloved hands stained with antiseptic and blood. 27 separate lacerations, some down to the muscle. "Someone did this deliberately, Mason." Mason nodded grimly. "I know. This wasn't an accident." While the veterinary team had been focused on Belle's immediate medical needs, Mason had scouted the surrounding area. What he'd found had turned his stomach. The barbed wire hadn't simply been discarded fencing that Belle had accidentally wandered into. It had been methodically arranged, concealed beneath thin coverings of dirt and brush. A trap. "Look at this," Mason said, leading Dr. Reynolds a short distance away. He pointed to disturbed earth where he'd uncovered part of the trap. 3 separate strands anchored to buried stakes. She was meant to walk into this. Dr. Reynolds frowned. "Who would do such a thing, and why?" Mason didn't answer immediately. Instead, he walked a wider perimeter, his experienced eyes scanning the ground. 50 yards from Belle's position, he stopped, crouching to examine something half hidden in the parched grass. "Footprints," he called. "At least 2 different people. And look here." He pointed to a small metal spike driven into the ground. "Trail camera mount. Someone was monitoring this trap." Dr. Reynolds joined him, her face grim. "Poachers? Maybe." Mason straightened, surveying the landscape with narrowed eyes. "But why trap a pregnant cow? Brahman aren't typically targeted for their horns like some other breeds." A thought struck him, and he turned to look at Titan. The bull's impressive stature, his unusual coloration for a Brahman, that steel gray hide instead of the typical white, and his magnificent horn spread would make him a prized trophy. "It's not about her," Mason said quietly. "She's bait." Understanding dawned on Dr. Reynolds' face. "For him? The bull?" Mason nodded. "Titan is exceptional. Prime breeding stock at minimum, but more likely targeted as a trophy hunt. Belle is his mate. They used her to draw him in." The radio at Mason's hip crackled to life, startling them both. Director Harrington's voice cut through the static. "Blackwood report? What's the status on that injured cow?" Mason unclipped the radio. "Medical intervention ongoing, sir. But we've got a situation here. Evidence of poaching activity, specifically targeting these Brahman cattle. Casualties? 1 pregnant female with severe injuries. We're treating her now." A pause. "Resource allocation?" Mason gritted his teeth. Harrington always reduced everything to numbers and resources. "Full vet team on site. Estimated treatment time, 24 hours. Another pause. Longer this time. "That's a significant allocation for a non-endangered specimen, Blackwood. Is it worth it?" Mason felt heat rise in his neck that had nothing to do with the Texas sun. "With respect, sir, this isn't just about 1 cow. We've got evidence of organized poaching on reserve land. The pregnant cow was used as bait." "This operation is bigger than we thought. I'll send Jenkins and Rodriguez to collect evidence, but I need a decision on the cow. If she's too far gone—" "She's not," Mason interrupted. "Dr. Reynolds believes we can save both mother and calf." "At what cost, Blackwood? We're already stretched thin with the drought conditions, and headquarters is breathing down my neck about budget overruns." Mason watched the medical team working frantically to stabilize Belle. He thought of Sarah, of promises made, of second chances that rarely come. "I'll cover any extra cost myself if I have to, sir. But we're saving this cow." The silence that followed spoke volumes. Finally, Harrington's voice returned, resignation evident. "On your head be it, Mason, but I want hourly updates, and if her condition deteriorates beyond reasonable intervention—" "Understood." Blackwood out. Mason clipped the radio back to his belt before Harrington could say more. Dr. Reynolds gave him a knowing look. He won't be happy when he finds out you're using department resources for personal reasons. This isn't personal, Mason replied automatically, then caught himself. Or maybe it is, but it's also the right thing to do. Before Dr. Reynolds could respond, one of her technicians called urgently from beneath the canopy. "Doctor, her temperature's spiking, 104.5 and rising." They rushed back to find Belle in distress, her sedated form shuddering with fever. The second veterinarian was already preparing additional antibiotics. "The infection's advancing faster than I anticipated," Dr. Reynolds said, pulling on fresh gloves. "We need to get more aggressive with treatment." Mason watched helplessly as the team worked, feeling the minutes ticking away. Belle's chances, and her unborn calves, were diminishing with each passing moment. Outside the canopy, Titan bellowed as if sensing the deteriorating situation. "What do you need?" Mason asked. "Whatever it is, I'll get it." "Doctor." Reynolds didn't look up from her work. "We need stronger antibiotics than what we brought, and more fluids. She's critically dehydrated, which is compromising her ability to fight the infection." "Where can I get them?" "The main veterinary facility back at headquarters has what we need, but it's an hour drive each way. And with this heat—" Mason was already moving toward his truck. "Make me a list. I'll be back before you know it." As he started the engine, Mason glanced back at Titan, still standing his solemn vigil. "Stay with her," he said, though he knew the bull couldn't understand him. "I'll be back." The drive to headquarters was a blur of dust and determination. Mason pushed his truck harder than was wise on the rutted service roads, each minute feeling like a lifetime. As he approached the main compound, he noticed dark clouds gathering on the western horizon, a rare sight after weeks of drought. Weather Service had mentioned the possibility of isolated storms, but in Texas summer such predictions were often empty promises. Still, Mason felt uneasy. Flash floods were no joke in this terrain. If a storm did hit, the dry creek beds would fill within minutes, potentially cutting off access to Belle's location. At the veterinary facility, Mason nearly collided with a lanky young man exiting the supply room. The man jumped back, startled. "Uncle Mason, what are you doing here?" Mason blinked in surprise. "Caleb, I thought you were working the north section today." Caleb Blackwood, his sister's son and newest member of the Ranger team, shifted uncomfortably, adjusting his grip on a small duffel bag. "Yeah, I was, but Harrington reassigned me to help with supply inventory." Something in Caleb's demeanor struck Mason as off, but he had no time to dwell on it. "I need emergency supplies for a field treatment." "Pregnant Brahman cow with severe injuries and infection." "Oh, right. I heard about that on the radio." Caleb stepped aside. "Everything should be stocked. Need help carrying anything?" "I've got it," Mason said, brushing past him with Dr. Reynolds' list clutched in his hand. He worked quickly, gathering the requested antibiotics, IV fluids, and additional medical equipment. As he loaded the supplies into his truck, Mason noticed Caleb watching from the doorway, that same duffel bag still clutched in his hands. For a brief moment their eyes met, and Mason was struck by something he couldn't quite place. Guilt? Fear? But then Caleb nodded casually and turned away, walking briskly toward the staff parking area. Mason frowned. In the 3 months since Caleb had joined the reserve team, something had seemed increasingly off about his nephew. The once eager young man who had idolized his Ranger uncle had become withdrawn, secretive. Mason had chalked it up to the pressures of the job, but now he wondered if there was more to it. The western sky had darkened considerably by the time Mason pulled away from headquarters. The storm was moving in faster than expected, and Mason pressed the accelerator harder, racing against both the weather and Belle's ticking clock. Halfway back to the field station, Mason's radio crackled. Base to Blackwood. Weather alert issued for your sector. Flash flood warning in effect. Return to headquarters immediately. Mason gripped the steering wheel tighter. Negative, Base. I have critical medical supplies for the field team. This is a direct order, Blackwood. Harrington's voice cut in. We've got a major cell moving in. All field personnel are to return to base immediately. Mason glanced at the supplies beside him, then at the darkening sky. Belle would die without these medications. Her calf would never have a chance at life. Sorry, sir, Mason said into the radio. You're breaking up. We'll report when mission is complete. He switched the radio off before Harrington could respond. As he neared the location where the service road crossed a normally dry creek bed, Mason saw the first raindrops hit his windshield. The darkening sky split with lightning, and thunder rumbled across the landscape like a warning. Mason urged his truck faster, knowing what was at stake. He had made a promise, to Sarah, to himself, and now to Titan and Belle. No storm was going to stop him from keeping it. Just as he reached the creek crossing, Mason noticed something that made him slam on the brakes. There, partially hidden among the scrub oak beside the road, was a black pickup truck he didn't recognize. No reserve logos, no government plates, just a plain vehicle that had no business being this deep in the protected area. And on its tailgate, barely visible from Mason's angle, was something that turned his blood cold. A coil of barbed wire, identical to what had been used to trap Belle. The pieces suddenly clicked together in Mason's mind. The deliberate trap. Caleb's strange behavior. The duffel bag. His nephew's sudden financial stability despite his modest ranger salary. Ah, hell, Mason whispered, reaching for his radio before remembering he'd turned it off. As the first heavy raindrops began to fall in earnest, Mason made a decision. The medical supplies had to get through, but now he also needed to warn Dr. Reynolds about potential danger. The poachers hadn't left. They were still here, waiting for their prize. And if Mason's terrible suspicion was correct, his own nephew was helping them. Rain hammered against Mason's truck as he maneuvered around the suspicious black pickup. His mind raced, piecing together a puzzle he didn't want to solve. Caleb, his sister's boy, the kid who'd spent summers following him around the reserve, learning animal tracks and ranger protocols, couldn't possibly be involved in something so cruel. Yet the evidence was mounting, each piece more damning than the last. Mason had practically raised Caleb after his father walked out, taught him to fish in the reserve's eastern creek, showed him how to identify different animal tracks, celebrated when he followed in Mason's footsteps and joined the ranger service 3 months ago. "Damn it, Caleb," Mason muttered, squinting through the rain-streaked windshield. "What have you gotten yourself into?" The truck lurched as Mason navigated the increasingly muddy road. He needed to reach Belle and the medical team before the storm worsened, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was missing something critical about the situation. If poachers were still in the area, Dr. Reynolds and her team could be in danger. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the landscape in stark white. In that brief flash, Mason spotted something on the ridge above the makeshift veterinary station, a glint of metal that disappeared as quickly as it had appeared. Binoculars, or worse, a rifle scope. Mason killed his headlights and pulled the truck behind a stand of mesquite trees, grabbing his rain gear and the medical supplies. He needed to approach cautiously now, assess the situation before revealing his presence. Years of anti-poaching work had taught him that rushing in could make things worse. Keeping low, Mason worked his way down the slope toward the veterinary station. The rain provided good cover, masking his footsteps and limiting visibility. As he drew closer, he could make out the canopy where Belle was being treated, Dr. Reynolds and her team still working despite the downpour. Titan was no longer visible from Mason's position, but he suspected the bull had sought shelter under the nearby stand of cottonwoods. The real question was where the poachers were and what they were waiting for. Mason circled wide, scanning the surrounding area for any sign of human presence. The ridge where he'd spotted the reflection seemed the most likely observation point. Making a decision, he changed course, climbing carefully toward it. Halfway up, Mason froze. The sound of voices carried on the wind. Two men, arguing in hushed but heated tones. He crept closer, straining to hear over the rain. "Should have been a clean job. Get the bull, take the horns, be out before anyone knew. It's not my fault the cow got so tangled up. Besides, Blackwood wasn't supposed to be patrolling this section today." Mason's breath caught. The second voice belonged to Caleb. "Your uncle's causing problems. If he hadn't found the cow so quickly, he'll back off once the storm hits full force. Safety protocols." "He'd better. We've got buyers waiting, and that bull's horns are worth 20 grand easy." Mason had heard enough. He began to back away slowly, planning to warn Dr. Reynolds and call for backup. But as he shifted his weight, his boot dislodged a stone that clattered down the slope. The voices immediately went silent. "What was that?" the first man hissed. "Probably just an animal," Caleb replied, but his tone betrayed uncertainty. Mason remained motionless, hardly daring to breathe. Rain trickled down his neck as he weighed his options. He could make a run for it, but that would confirm his presence. Better to stay put and hope they dismissed the noise. "Check it out," the first man ordered. Mason heard footsteps approaching and knew his window of opportunity was closing. Carefully he reached for his service pistol, rarely used but always carried in the field. Before he could draw it, a beam of light cut through the rain, catching him in its glare. "Uncle Mason?" Caleb's voice cracked with surprise and something else. Fear. For a long moment, uncle and nephew stared at each other, the rain beating a steady rhythm around them. Caleb looked different somehow, harder, older than his 23 years. Behind him stood a heavy-set man Mason didn't recognize, his hand hovering near what was clearly a holstered weapon. "What are you doing here, Caleb?" Mason asked quietly, though he already knew the answer. Caleb's jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have come up here. And you shouldn't be trapping and killing animals on protected land," Mason countered, rising slowly to his feet. "That cow down there is suffering because of what you did." "It's just business," the other man cut in, his voice cold. "Nothing personal. It became personal when you involved my nephew," Mason said, not taking his eyes off Caleb. "And when you tortured an animal I'm sworn to protect." Caleb's expression flickered between defiance and shame. "You don't understand, Uncle Mason. I needed the money." "For what? What could possibly be worth this?" Mason gestured toward the veterinary station below. Caleb looked away. "I owe people. Bad people. Gambling debts." The pieces fell into place. The new truck Caleb had bought last month, the unexplained absences, the way he'd avoided family dinners. Mason had attributed it all to the adjustment of a new job, never suspecting something darker. "How much?" Mason asked. 30,000, Caleb admitted, with interest adding every week. "So you decided to start poaching? On my reserve?" Mason couldn't keep the disappointment from his voice. "Look, this is all very touching," the other man interrupted, "but we've got a job to finish." "That bull isn't going to shoot itself." He turned to Caleb. "Deal with this, now." Mason saw something shift in Caleb's expression, a hardening, a decision being made. His nephew's hand moved toward his waistband, where Mason now noticed the outline of a concealed weapon. "Don't do this, Caleb," Mason said softly. "Whatever you've done, we can fix it, but not if you cross this line." Raindrops mixed with tears on Caleb's face. "I'm sorry, Uncle Mason. I don't have a choice." "There's always a choice," Mason said, thinking of Sarah, of promises kept and broken. "Your mother would say the same thing." At the mention of his mother, Caleb hesitated. "Enough talk," the other man snapped, drawing his own weapon. "If you won't handle it, I will." Everything happened in a blur after that. The man raised his gun toward Mason. Caleb shouted, "No!" and lunged forward. There was a struggle, a flash as lightning split the sky again, and then a single gunshot echoed across the ridge. Mason braced for pain, but it was the other man who stumbled backward, clutching his shoulder where Caleb's intervention had sent the bullet wide. "Run!" Caleb shouted to Mason, still grappling with his partner. "Get to the station!" Mason hesitated only a moment before grabbing the medical supplies and racing down the slope toward the veterinary station. Behind him, he heard another shot, then silence. Dr. Reynolds looked up in alarm as Mason burst into the treatment area, rain-soaked and breathless. "Poachers on the ridge," Mason gasped, handing over the medical supplies. "At least 2 of them. They're after Titan." "Your nephew?" Dr. Reynolds asked, quickly opening the antibiotics. "It's complicated," Mason replied, scanning the area. "Where is Titan?" One of the technicians pointed toward the cottonwoods. "He moved over there when the storm started." Mason nodded, relieved. "How's Belle?" "Critical, but responding," Dr. Reynolds said, "already preparing an injection." "These antibiotics came just in time. What about the poachers?" "I don't know," Mason admitted, thinking of Caleb and the gunshots. "But we need to be ready to move if necessary." As Dr. Reynolds administered the new medications, Mason stepped outside the canopy, peering through the rain toward the ridge. No sign of movement, but that didn't mean they were safe. The radio at his belt suddenly crackled to life. "Uncle Mason?" Caleb's voice was strained, barely audible above the storm. "Are you there?" Mason grabbed the radio. "I'm here. Are you okay?" He's down. I didn't mean to. The gun just went off when we were struggling." Mason closed his eyes briefly. "Is he alive?" "Yes, but hurt bad. I need help getting him down from here." "Stay put. I'll come to you." "No!" Caleb's voice sharpened. "There are others. 3 more, coming from the north access road. They were supposed to be backup for when we got Titan." Mason's blood ran cold. "When?" "They should be there any minute. You need to move Belle and get out." Mason looked at the sedated cow, the medical equipment, the team of vets working frantically to save her. Moving her now could kill her. "We can't move her, Caleb. She won't survive." Silence on the radio, then. "I'm coming down. I'll help however I can." Before Mason could respond, the radio went silent. He turned to Dr. Reynolds, who had heard everything. "How long before she can be transported?" he asked. Dr. Reynolds shook her head. 6 hours minimum. The antibiotics need time to work, and we've just stabilized her. Moving her now would kill her and the calf. Mason made a quick decision. "Keep working. I'll handle the poachers." "How?" "There are 3 of them, and only 1 of you." Mason checked his service pistol. 2 of us. Caleb's coming." As if on cue, Caleb appeared at the edge of the clearing, soaked and mud-streaked, but apparently unharmed. His face was a mask of shame and determination as he approached his uncle. "I'm sorry," he said simply. "I never meant for any of this to happen." Mason studied his nephew's face, seeing both the boy he'd raised and the man who'd made terrible choices. "We'll talk about that later. Right now, we need to protect Belle and Titan." Caleb nodded, pulling out his own service weapon. "The others are professionals, hunters from East Texas. They've done this before, many times." "How much time do we have?" "Minutes, maybe less." Mason's mind raced, considering options. They were outnumbered and outgunned. Belle couldn't be moved. The storm was worsening, with flash flood warnings in effect, and somewhere nearby Titan was hiding, unaware he was the target of all this chaos. "We need to lead them away," Mason decided. "Make them think Titan is somewhere else." Caleb caught on quickly. "The North Ridge. There's another small herd of cattle up there." If they think Titan joined them. Exactly. You head that way, make some noise, leave some obvious tracks. I'll stay here and protect Belle. They'll kill you if they find you, Caleb protested. They won't find me, Mason assured him, though he was far from certain. Go now. And Caleb, he gripped his nephew's shoulder, this is your chance to make things right. Caleb held his uncle's gaze for a moment, then nodded once before disappearing into the rain-drenched landscape. Mason turned back to the veterinary team. Keep working, but stay quiet, and keep the lights low. I'm going to find Titan. What are you going to do? Dr. Reynolds asked, concern etched on her face. Mason checked the time, 16 hours remaining in Belle's critical period. 16 hours they needed to buy at all costs. Whatever I have to, he answered grimly. Moving quietly through the rain, Mason headed toward the cottonwoods where Titan had last been seen. The massive bull was indeed there, standing motionless beneath the largest tree, his gray hide almost invisible in the gathering darkness. As Mason approached, Titan turned his head, those intelligent eyes finding him even through the downpour. They're coming for you, Mason said softly, knowing the bull couldn't understand his words but hoping somehow to convey the danger. We need to keep you safe. Titan snorted softly, his breath visible in the cooling air. For a wild moment Mason considered trying to lead the bull away himself, but he knew it was impossible. Titan wouldn't leave Belle. In that moment, watching the bull's unwavering vigil, Mason saw himself, a mirror of his own stubborn loyalty, his own inability to leave behind those he loved, even when staying put was dangerous. The sound of an approaching vehicle cut through the rain. Time had run out. Mason crouched in the shadows beneath the cottonwoods, rain dripping from his hat brim as he watched headlights cut through the darkness. The approaching vehicle moved slowly, cautiously, navigating the muddy terrain. Even through the storm's fury, Mason could make out the outline of a large pickup with off-road modifications, the kind favored by hunters who needed to access remote areas. Easy, big fella, Mason whispered to Titan, who stood unnaturally still beside him, as if understanding the need for silence. The bull's massive presence should have been impossible to conceal, yet the storm and gathering darkness worked in their favor. The truck stopped about 100 yards from the veterinary station. Mason counted 3 men emerging, their forms barely visible through the rain. They moved with practiced efficiency, retrieving rifles from the truck bed and checking something that Mason guessed was tracking equipment. His radio crackled softly. "Uncle Mason?" Caleb's voice was barely audible above the rain. "I'm at the North Ridge. No sign of them following yet." "Stay put," Mason whispered into the radio. "They're here. 3 men, armed. I'll radio when it's clear." As the poachers conferred among themselves, Mason's mind flashed back to another rainy night 7 years ago. He'd been sitting by the phone in the ranger station, waiting for Sarah to call. She was always good about checking in when she reached town, especially with the storm that night. When the call finally came, it wasn't her voice but a solemn state trooper explaining about wet roads and a deer in a car tumbled down an embankment. Mason remembered driving through that storm, windshield wipers beating a desperate rhythm that couldn't match his racing heart. The hospital corridors had seemed endless, their fluorescent lights harsh against his rain-soaked clothes. Too late, always too late. The doctor's words had washed over him like another wave of rain. "We did everything we could. Internal bleeding. The baby never had a chance." A crash of thunder yanked Mason back to the present. The poachers were moving toward the veterinary station, rifles raised against the elements. Mason touched the radio at his belt. "Dr. Reynolds," he whispered. 3 armed men approaching from the west. "Stay down. Stay quiet." "Copy that," came the terse reply. "Belle's sedated. We've dimmed all lights." Mason looked at Titan, torn between leading the bull to safety and protecting Belle. As if sensing his indecision, Titan lowered his massive head, nudging Mason's shoulder with surprising gentleness. Then, to Mason's astonishment, the bull moved silently away, disappearing into the rain like a gray ghost. The poachers reached the veterinary canopy, their voices carrying faintly through the storm. "What the hell is this?" One man gestured at the medical equipment. "Rangers got to the cow. Look at all this. Full medical setup." "Where's the bull? Tracking says he should be right here." Mason slipped from tree to tree, working his way closer. He needed to draw them away without endangering Dr. Reynolds and her team. His hand moved to his service pistol, though he hoped it wouldn't come to that. "Check the transmitter again," the apparent leader ordered. "That bull's worth too much to lose now." One of the men consulted a handheld device. "Signal's moving north, fast." Mason frowned. What signal? Then understanding dawned. They must have placed a tracker on Belle, knowing Titan would stay close to her. But if the signal was moving north, Caleb, his nephew, must have found the tracker and was leading them away. "Let's move," the leader decided. "Bull's heading for the open range. Easier shot there anyway." As the poachers returned to their vehicle, Mason allowed himself a moment of relief. Belle and the medical team were safe for now. But Caleb was deliberately drawing dangerous men toward himself. Once the poachers' taillights disappeared into the rain, Mason hurried to the veterinary station. Dr. Reynolds looked up from where she was monitoring Belle's vital signs. "They're gone?" she asked. Mason nodded. "For now. How is she?" "Improving. The new antibiotics are working, and her fever's coming down." Dr. Reynolds nodded toward Belle's massive belly. "The calf's heartbeat is stable. We got lucky." "We're not out of danger yet," Mason cautioned, checking his watch. 14 hours remained in Belle's critical period. Those men will be back once they realize they've been tricked. "Where's Titan?" Mason glanced toward the darkness where the bull had disappeared. "I don't know. He moved off just before the poachers arrived, almost like he knew." Dr. Reynolds gave him a skeptical look. "Mason, I know you have a connection with these animals, but even you have to admit that's a stretch." Mason shrugged. After 20 years as a ranger, he'd learned to trust his instincts about wildlife. And something about Titan defied conventional understanding. "I need to help Caleb," he said, checking his pistol. "He's drawing the poachers away, but he's outnumbered." "You can't go out in this," one of the vet techs protested, gesturing to the worsening storm. "Flash flood warnings are still in effect. The creek beds will be filling." Mason knew she was right. The network of dry creeks that crisscrossed the reserve could transform into raging torrents within minutes during a heavy downpour. But Caleb was out there, alone, facing armed men because of a mistake he was trying to rectify. "I have to try," Mason said simply. "Keep Belle stable. I'll be back." As Mason prepared to leave, Dr. Reynolds caught his arm. "Be careful. That cow needs you to come back in one piece." Her eyes held something more than professional concern. "We all do." 7 months after Sarah's death, Dr. Reynolds had been the one to find Mason alone in his cabin, surrounded by empty whiskey bottles and unwashed clothes. She'd been new to the reserve then, unaware of his history but unwilling to leave a colleague in such a state. She'd opened windows, made coffee, and sat with him in silence until he'd finally spoken about Sarah, about the child they'd lost, about the future that had died with them. Ellie Reynolds had saved him then, in her quiet, efficient way. She'd never pushed for more than friendship, understanding that Mason's heart remained buried with his wife and unborn son. But she'd been there, a steady presence through the darkest days. "I'll be careful," Mason promised, holding her gaze for a moment before stepping back into the storm. The rain had intensified, turning the landscape into a treacherous maze of mud and limited visibility. Mason's truck struggled on the saturated ground as he followed the tire tracks left by the poachers. His headlights caught the glint of rising water in a crossing ahead, the first sign that the flash flood warnings were manifesting. Mason's radio crackled with static before Caleb's voice broke through. "Uncle Mason, they're on to me. I led them to the North Ridge, but they've figured out the tracker was removed from the cow." "Where are you now?" "Heading east along Fleming Creek. It's rising fast." Caleb's voice held a note of fear. "These guys mean business, Uncle Mason. One of them recognized me from the reserve, said they'd take care of me after they finished the job." "Stay ahead of them, Caleb. I'm on my way." Mason pressed the accelerator harder, knowing each minute counted. "And stay out of the creek bed." "It's going to flood." "Too late for that," Caleb replied grimly. "I'm on the only road out, and it crosses the creek twice." Mason swore under his breath. The eastern section of Fleming Creek was notorious for flash flooding. During the last major storm, a ranger vehicle had been swept away, the driver barely escaping with his life. "Listen to me carefully," Mason said, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Get to higher ground immediately. Abandon your vehicle if necessary. Do you remember the old fire watch tower?" "Near Broken Ridge?" "Yeah, I think so." "Head there. It's the highest point for 3 miles. I'll meet you." The radio went silent for several long seconds, and Mason felt his heart constrict with fear. Then Caleb's voice returned, breathless. "Creek's already over the road. Water's rising fast. I'm going to try to reach that tower. I'm coming, Caleb. Just hold on." As Mason navigated the increasingly treacherous roads, memories of another night haunted him. The night he'd held Titan as a trembling calf, promising Sarah they'd raise him together. The night he'd imagined their son growing up alongside the young bull, learning about nature's wonders firsthand. "I couldn't save them," Mason whispered to himself, gripping the steering wheel tighter as his truck slid in the mud. "But I'm saving you, Caleb. I'm saving you." The road ahead disappeared beneath a sheet of rushing water. Mason stopped, calculating. The crossing was at least 30 feet wide now, the current visibly strong. Too dangerous for the truck. Making a decision, Mason grabbed his emergency kit and rain gear. He'd have to continue on foot, following the ridgeline to reach the fire tower. As he stepped out into the deluge, a sound cut through the storm, a familiar deep bellow that couldn't possibly be what he thought it was. Mason turned, squinting through the rain. There, on the ridge above him, stood Titan's unmistakable silhouette, powerful and imposing against the storm-dark sky. "What the hell?" Mason breathed. The bull should have been miles away, safely hidden or protecting Belle. Instead, he was here, as if he'd been following Mason all along. Titan bellowed again, then began moving along the ridge, stopping to look back at Mason as if expecting him to follow. Mason hesitated only briefly before scrambling up the muddy slope. Logic told him to ignore the bull and continue toward the fire tower. But 2 decades in the wilderness had taught Mason to trust animal behavior more than human reasoning sometimes. Titan led him along the ridge, sure-footed despite the treacherous conditions. The path, Mason realized, ran parallel to the flooded road below, but stayed on higher ground. The bull was leading him on a safer route to the same destination. "I'll be damned," Mason muttered, following the massive animal through the darkness. Below them, headlights cut through the rain, the poacher's truck attempting to navigate the flooded road. Mason watched as they reached the water crossing and stopped, clearly assessing the danger. His radio crackled again. "Uncle Mason?" Caleb's voice was higher now, edged with panic. "I can't reach the tower. Road's completely washed out ahead. I'm stuck on a high point, but the water's still rising." Mason felt a cold dread that had nothing to do with the rain soaking through his clothes. "Where exactly?" "Old Cattle Bridge. I'm on the concrete support in the middle. Water's already taken the wooden walkway. Mason knew the spot, a disused crossing with concrete pillars supporting what had once been a wooden bridge for moving cattle between pastures. If Caleb was stranded on the center support, he was surrounded by rushing water on all sides. "Hold on, Caleb." "I'm coming." Mason looked ahead to where Titan waited, somehow patient despite the storm raging around them. "I need to reach the old cattle bridge," he told the bull, feeling foolish for speaking to an animal but desperate enough to try anything. "My nephew's in trouble." To Mason's astonishment, Titan turned away from their current path, heading southeast along a game trail Mason hadn't noticed. The bull moved with purpose, stopping occasionally to ensure Mason was still following. The rain had plastered Mason's clothes to his body, and exhaustion pulled at his limbs, but he pushed forward, trusting this improbable guide. When they crested a small rise, Mason saw it. The remains of the cattle bridge, a lone figure huddled on the center support surrounded by churning water. "Caleb!" Mason shouted, but his voice was lost in the storm. Titan bellowed, the sound carrying where human voices couldn't. On the concrete pillar, Caleb's head snapped up, searching for the source. When he spotted Mason and the bull on the ridge, he waved frantically. Mason assessed the situation quickly. The water level was still rising. The distance was too great to throw a rope. Swimming was suicide in that current. "How do I reach him?" Mason asked aloud, the question directed at both himself and the massive bull beside him. Titan responded by moving down the slope toward the water's edge. Mason followed, wondering what the animal could possibly show him. When they reached the bank, Titan stopped at a narrow section of the flood where the current, while still dangerous, was less turbulent than at the bridge. The bull stepped into the water, then looked back at Mason. "You can't be serious," Mason said incredulously. Titan took another step into the flood, water now reaching his massive chest. He remained steady, immovable against the current. In that moment, Mason understood. With a deep breath, he waded in beside the bull, using Titan's bulk as a shield against the rushing water. Together, they moved slowly across, Titan's strength and weight creating a buffer that allowed Mason to keep his footing where he would otherwise have been swept away. When they reached the other side, Mason patted the bull's soaked flank in wordless gratitude before hurrying toward the bridge. From this angle, he could see Caleb's predicament more clearly. The concrete support was an island in a sea of debris-filled water, with no safe path to shore. "Caleb!" Mason shouted, louder this time. "I'm here!" His nephew looked up, relief and fear mingling on his face. "The water's still rising," he called back. "Another foot, and this pillar goes under." Mason scanned the area desperately, looking for anything that might help. His gaze fell on Titan, who had followed him to the bridge approach. An idea formed, crazy, dangerous, but possibly their only chance. "Caleb," Mason called, "I'm sending help. Be ready to grab on." Before his nephew could respond, Mason turned to Titan. For a long moment, man and bull regarded each other through the curtain of rain. Then Mason carefully removed his belt, fashioning it into a makeshift lead that he gently secured around Titan's massive horns. "I need your help one more time," Mason said softly, stroking the bull's wet face. "We need to save him." Guiding Titan to the bridge approach, Mason pointed toward Caleb. "Go to him," he urged, giving the makeshift lead a gentle tug in that direction. "Go on." To Mason's amazement, and yet somehow not to his surprise, Titan seemed to understand. The bull stepped carefully onto what remained of the bridge approach, testing each step before committing his weight. The wooden structure creaked ominously but held beneath his hooves. Caleb watched in disbelief as the massive bull made its way toward him, somehow navigating the treacherous, partially submerged timbers with a grace that defied his size. "Grab his horns when he reaches you," Mason shouted. "He'll bring you back." "Are you crazy?" Caleb yelled back, but his eyes were fixed on the approaching bull with something like wonder. When Titan reached the concrete pillar, he stopped, lowering his great head toward Caleb. For a suspended moment, nephew and bull regarded each other, the poacher and his intended prey, while the storm raged around them. Then Caleb reached out, grasping the makeshift lead and Titan's horn. With a careful pivot, the bull turned back toward shore, carrying his human cargo to safety, one precarious step at a time. Mason watched, heart in his throat, as the unlikely pair made their way back. When they finally reached solid ground, Caleb collapsed to his knees, shaking with cold and relief. "Uncle Mason," he gasped, looking up at the bull that had saved his life. "How did you? Why would he?" Mason helped his nephew to his feet, both of them leaning against Titan's solid presence for support. "7 years ago I saved him," Mason said simply. "Today he returned the favor." As they made their way back up the ridge, the storm beginning to abate, Mason's radio crackled once more. Dr. Reynolds' voice cut through the static. "Mason? Come in, Mason. We've got poachers at the medical station. They found Belle." The momentary relief vanished. Mason checked his watch. 12 hours remained in Belle's critical period. 12 hours they still needed to secure. "We're coming," Mason responded, looking at his nephew and the bull who had saved them both. "And we're bringing reinforcements." The storm had passed its peak, transforming from a raging downpour to a steady, soaking rain. Mason, Caleb, and Titan moved as quickly as the treacherous terrain allowed, following a route that skirted the worst of the flooding. Despite his massive size, Titan navigated the mud with surprising agility, sometimes pausing to wait for the humans struggling behind him. "I still can't believe he saved me," Caleb said, his voice barely audible above the rain. "After what I helped do to Belle." Mason glanced at his nephew, seeing genuine remorse in his eyes. "Animals don't hold grudges the way people do," he replied. "They live in the moment. Right now, Titan's only concern is getting back to Belle." As if understanding his name, the bull quickened his pace, pulling ahead on the muddy trail. "How did you get involved with poachers, Caleb?" Mason asked the question that had been burning in his mind. "Your mother would be heartbroken." Caleb's shoulders slumped. "It started with poker games in El Paso. Small stakes at first, then bigger. I kept thinking I could win back what I'd lost." He shook his head. "Before I knew it, I owed 30,000 to people who don't take IOUs. So you agreed to help them poach on the reserve. They said no one would get hurt. Just identify valuable trophies, create access points, look the other way." Caleb's voice cracked. "I never thought they'd torture an animal like that. When I saw what they did to Belle." Mason remembered the young boy who had cried over injured birds, who had helped Mason rehabilitate countless wounded creatures. That boy was still there, beneath the mistakes and poor choices. "There's always a way back, Caleb," Mason said, thinking of his own dark days after Sarah's death. "But first we need to save Belle and stop those poachers." They crested a ridge that overlooked the veterinary station. Through the rain, Mason could make out 2 vehicles parked nearby, the poacher's truck and another he didn't recognize. 3 armed men stood beneath the canopy where Belle lay, confronting Dr. Reynolds and her team. Mason assessed the situation quickly. The poachers held the advantage of position and firepower. A direct approach would put the veterinary team at risk. They needed a diversion. "What's the plan?" Caleb whispered, crouching beside his uncle. Mason's gaze shifted to Titan, who stood alert, eyes fixed on the scene below. The bull seemed to radiate a controlled fury, his massive muscles tense beneath his rain-slicked hide. "They came for Titan," Mason said slowly. "So we'll give them what they want. But on our terms." He explained his plan quickly. Caleb would circle around to approach the station from the east, using his ranger credentials if challenged. Meanwhile, Mason would create a diversion from the western approach. And Titan would be their secret weapon. "Are you sure he'll cooperate?" Caleb asked, eyeing the bull doubtfully. Mason looked at Titan, meeting those intelligent eyes. "I'm not sure of anything," he admitted, "but I trust him." They separated, Caleb moving silently through the brush, while Mason and Titan took a position that offered a clear view of the confrontation below. Through the rain, Mason could hear raised voices. "The tracker says the bull should be here." One of the poachers was shouting at Dr. Reynolds. "I've told you 3 times." Ellie's voice was steady despite the danger. "We haven't seen the bull in hours. Now let us continue treating this cow before you kill her too." "The cow doesn't matter," another man replied dismissively. "It's the bull we want. Prime trophy specimen." "You do realize you're committing multiple felonies?" Ellie challenged. "Poaching on federal land, threatening federal employees, animal cruelty." The crack of a slap cut through the rain. Mason tensed as he saw one of the poachers strike Ellie across the face. Beside him, Titan let out a low, rumbling growl. "One more smart comment and we start shooting your team one by one," the man threatened. "Now where is the bull?" Mason had seen enough. He lifted his service pistol, aimed at the sky, and fired twice. The shots echoed across the clearing, causing the poachers to whirl toward the sound. "This is Ranger Mason Blackwood," he shouted. "You are surrounded by federal officers. Drop your weapons and surrender." It was a bluff, but in the rain and darkness, the poachers couldn't know that. They hesitated, conferring urgently among themselves. "We have your man Caleb," the leader called back. "Surrender now or he dies." Mason's blood ran cold. Had Caleb been captured already? But then he caught a glimpse of movement on the far side of the clearing, his nephew slipping into position. The poachers were bluffing too. "Release my medical team and I'll consider terms," Mason replied, playing for time. He touched Titan's flank, feeling the tense muscles beneath his fingers. "Almost time," he whispered to the bull. Below, the leader signaled to his men. 2 of them grabbed Dr. Reynolds, using her as a shield, while the third kept his weapon trained on the other veterinary staff. "Here's our counteroffer," the leader shouted. "Show yourself now, or the doctor dies. You have 10 seconds. Mason touched his radio. "Caleb, they've got Ellie. Be ready to move on my signal." He looked at Titan one last time. "I hope you understand what we need," he said softly. The bull's gaze met his, and in that moment Mason felt a connection that transcended the barrier between species. Without further hesitation, Mason stepped out from cover, hands raised, his service pistol conspicuously holstered. "Here I am," he called, slowly walking down the slope. "Let her go." The poachers watched his approach warily, weapons trained on him. "Where's the bull?" the leader demanded. "Gone," Mason replied, continuing his careful descent. "He fled during the storm, probably miles away by now." The leader swore violently. "You're lying. The tracker was on the cow, not the bull," Mason interrupted. "Your plan failed. The bull is gone, the authorities are on their way, and you've added assault on federal officers to your charges. It's over." Mason was close enough now to see the indecision on the leader's face, the nervous glances between the men. He was also close enough to see the bruise forming on Ellie's cheekbone, the fear and determination in her eyes. "If the bull's gone, there's no reason to stay," one of the poachers muttered. "We should cut our losses." The leader hesitated, then nodded sharply. "Fine, but you're coming with us as insurance." He gestured with his rifle. "Both of you." Mason had reached the bottom of the slope, now standing 30 yards from the canopy. The moment of truth had arrived. He drew a deep breath and whistled. 3 sharp notes that cut through the rain. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. The poachers looked confused, glancing around for the source of the threat. Then the ground seemed to tremble, and from the darkness behind Mason came a sound that chilled the blood, the thunderous bellow of a bull charging at full speed. Titan burst from the shadows like an avenging spirit, 1,900 pounds of muscle and fury bearing down on the men who had threatened his mate. The sight was terrifying enough that the poachers momentarily forgot their hostages, turning their weapons toward this new threat. In that crucial moment of distraction, Mason drew his pistol and fired at the leader's leg, dropping him with a howl of pain. Simultaneously, Caleb emerged from the opposite side, tackling one of the other men to the ground. Dr. Reynolds, suddenly released, drove her elbow hard into her captor's solar plexus and broke free, shoving the veterinary technicians toward safety. Titan, meanwhile, charged straight for the remaining poacher, who fired wildly in panic. The shots went wide, and before he could correct his aim, 2,000 pounds of Brahman bull slammed into him, sending him flying into the mud. The clearing erupted into chaos. Mason sprinted forward, kicking away the fallen leader's weapon before securing him with handcuffs. Caleb was wrestling with his opponent, finally subduing him with a ranger restraint hold Mason had taught him years ago. Titan stood over the third man, who lay motionless in the mud, the bull's massive head lowered threateningly. The man remained perfectly still, terror evident in his eyes as the bull's hot breath washed over his face. "Don't move," Mason advised him as he approached cautiously. "He's deciding whether you're worth the trouble." With the situation under control, Mason checked on Ellie, gently touching the bruise on her face. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her eyes moving between Mason and the bull who had saved them all. "I think I owe you both an apology," she said with a shaky smile. "Seems your connection with that bull isn't so far-fetched after all." Once all three poachers were secured, Mason turned his attention to Belle. The pregnant cow was awake now, her dark eyes following the commotion. Despite the chaos, her condition appeared stable, her breathing steady. "How is she?" Mason asked anxiously. "Better than expected," Dr. Reynolds replied, checking the monitors. "The antibiotics are working. Her temperature's almost normal and the calf's heartbeat is strong. But we're not out of danger yet." Titan approached cautiously, nostrils flaring as he took in Belle's scent. The medical team tensed, but Mason motioned for them to stay calm. The bull stopped at the edge of the canopy, lowering his massive head to gently touch Belle's side, where her unborn calf rested. "I've never seen anything like it," one of the veterinary technicians whispered. "It's almost like he knows." "He does know," Mason said simply. "That's his family." The storm had finally passed, leaving behind a landscape transformed by water and mud. Dawn was breaking on the eastern horizon, casting a golden glow over the clearing. Mason stood outside the canopy, radio in hand, coordinating with reserve headquarters for transport of the prisoners and additional medical supplies. Director Harrington's voice crackled over the radio, his tone caught between irritation and reluctant admiration. 3 poachers apprehended, a pregnant cow saved, and no casualties. "How the hell did you manage that, Blackwood?" Mason looked at Titan, who had taken up a protective position beside Belle's makeshift bed. "I had help, sir." "The nephew you mentioned." "Caleb." Mason hesitated. Caleb's involvement with the poachers was a complicated issue that would need to be addressed. But the young man had risked his life to make things right, had helped capture the very men who had threatened him. "Yes, sir. Caleb was instrumental in apprehending the suspects," Mason said carefully. "I'll explain everything in my report." "See that you do," Harrington replied gruffly. "Backup should reach you within the hour. The roads are still bad from flooding." As Mason signed off, Caleb approached, his expression troubled. "You didn't tell him about my involvement." "That's a conversation for later," Mason said. "After we get Belle safely to the veterinary center." Caleb nodded, his eyes moving to the bull and cow. "What happens to them?" "That depends on Belle's recovery," Mason replied, "but they've earned their freedom, wherever that takes them." A soft sound from beneath the canopy drew their attention. Belle was struggling to rise, her massive form unsteady after hours of sedation. Dr. Reynolds moved quickly to her side. "She shouldn't be trying to stand yet," Ellie said with concern. "The strain could—" Belle let out a low, distressed moan that changed in pitch midway, becoming something more urgent. Titan responded immediately, moving closer, his posture alert. "What's happening?" Mason asked, alarmed. Dr. Reynolds checked Belle's vital signs, then moved to examine her hindquarters. Her expression shifted from concern to surprise. "The labor's starting," she announced. "The stress must have triggered it." "Is it too early?" Mason asked, remembering Sarah and all they had lost. "It's not ideal timing," Ellie admitted, "but the calf is fully developed." The bigger concern is Belle's weakened condition from the infection and injuries. The veterinary team sprang into action, preparing for an emergency delivery. Mason and Caleb stood back, giving them space to work. Titan, however, remained close to Belle's head, seemingly offering comfort as her contractions intensified. "Uncle Mason," Caleb said quietly, watching the scene unfold. "If something goes wrong—" Mason understood his nephew's fear. If Belle died after everything they'd done to save her, after all Titan had risked, it would be another failure, another loss in a life that had already seen too many. "Have faith," Mason said, though his own heart was racing with anxiety. "They're fighters, both of them." As the first rays of sunlight broke through the dispersing clouds, Belle's labor progressed with agonizing slowness. Dr. Reynolds worked tirelessly, her face tense with concentration as she monitored both mother and calf. "The calf is in the correct position," she reported at one point, "but Belle's too weak to push effectively. We may need to assist." Mason watched as the veterinary team prepared for an assisted delivery, laying out equipment and administering medication to strengthen Belle's contractions. Through it all, Titan remained a constant presence, occasionally nudging Belle's head gently as if encouraging her. "Mason!" Ellie called suddenly, urgency in her voice. "We need your help. The calf's shoulders are stuck, and Belle doesn't have the strength for the final push." Without hesitation, Mason moved to assist, following Dr. Reynolds' instructions. As he positioned himself to help guide the calf, he found himself face to face with Titan. The bull's dark eyes met his, and in that moment, Mason felt a profound connection. Two beings united in a desperate effort to preserve life. "Together," Mason said softly, not caring if anyone thought him crazy for speaking to the bull. "One more time." With Ellie directing, Mason applied careful pressure while the technicians monitored Belle's vital signs. Titan moved to Belle's head, pressing his forehead against hers in what looked remarkably like encouragement. Belle gathered her remaining strength for one final, monumental effort. With a rush of fluid and a collective gasp from the team, the calf slid into the world, wet, trembling, and perfectly formed. "It's a heifer," Dr. Reynolds announced, quickly clearing the calf's airways. "She's breathing." The newborn calf, gray like her father with a distinctive white star on her forehead, let out a weak bleat. Belle immediately responded, straining to see her baby despite her exhaustion. As the veterinary team cleaned the calf and checked her vital signs, Mason stepped back, overcome with emotion. 7 years after losing Sarah and their unborn son, he had helped bring new life into the world. The symmetry wasn't lost on him. A circle completed, a wound, if not healed, then at least acknowledged. Caleb approached, his eyes wide with wonder. "She's beautiful," he said softly. "Perfect." The team carefully placed the newborn calf beside her mother. Belle immediately began to clean her baby with gentle sweeps of her tongue. maternal instinct overriding her weakness and pain. Titan watched from a respectful distance, his massive frame somehow conveying both pride and tenderness. "Will they make it?" Caleb asked Dr. Reynolds, who was monitoring Belle's post-delivery vital signs. Ellie smiled, genuine relief in her expression. "The worst is behind us. Belle will need continued treatment for her injuries, but both she and the calf appear healthy." As the sun rose fully above the horizon, bathing the clearing in golden light, Mason found himself standing beside Titan once more. The bull acknowledged him with a soft snort, then returned his attention to his mate and newborn daughter. "You did it," Mason said quietly. "You saved them all. Belle, your calf, even Caleb and me." Titan's ear flicked in Mason's direction, the only indication he had heard. But as Mason watched the little family, the exhausted mother, the newborn calf, the protective father, he felt a sense of peace that had eluded him since Sarah's death. Some debts could never be repaid, some losses never fully healed. But life continued, finding its way forward despite tragedy and hardship. In saving Belle and her calf, Mason had somehow saved a piece of himself as well. The backup vehicles were visible now, making their slow approach across the flooded terrain. Soon the clearing would be filled with rangers and officials, the poachers would be transported to face justice, and decisions would need to be made about Caleb's future. But for this brief, perfect moment, Mason simply stood beside the bull who had become so much more than just an animal he had once rescued. Together, they watched a new life take its first uncertain steps in a world that, while dangerous, also contained unexpected allies and acts of courage that transcended species. The veterinary center at Reserve Headquarters buzzed with activity as staff prepared a specialized recovery stall for Belle and her newborn calf. 3 days had passed since the dramatic birth in the aftermath of the storm. The mother and baby had been carefully transported once Belle was stable enough to move, with Titan following the transport vehicle the entire way like a vigilant guardian. Mason stood at the observation window, watching as Dr. Reynolds conducted another examination of the calf. The little heifer, already nicknamed Star for the white marking on her forehead, was remarkably strong despite her traumatic entry into the world. She wobbled around her mother on spindly legs, her curiosity evident even at 3 days old. "She's thriving," Ellie said, joining Mason at the window. "Belle's recovering well, too. The antibiotics have cleared the infection and the wounds are healing cleanly." She gave him a sidelong glance. "I'd say our emergency field operation was a success." "Thanks to you and your team," Mason replied. "And Titan." At the mention of the bull, they both looked toward the large paddock visible through another window. Titan had been given access to a secure enclosure adjacent to Belle's recovery stall, close enough to see and smell his family, but separate enough to allow the veterinary team to work safely. The massive bull spent most of his time pressed against the dividing wall as close to Belle and Star as possible. "I've never seen behavior like his in a bull," Ellie admitted. "Particularly not with a Brahmin. They're not typically known for strong paternal instincts." "Titan's different," Mason said simply. "The DNA tests confirmed it," Ellie nodded. "He is definitely Star's father, and the genetic markers prove he's the same calf you rescued 7 years ago." She shook her head in wonder. "The odds against all this happening are astronomical, Mason." Before Mason could respond, Director Harrington appeared in the doorway, his expression characteristically stern. "Blackwood, a word." Mason followed his superior to a small office down the hall, steeling himself for the conversation to come. The last 3 days had been a whirlwind of debriefings, evidence processing, and explaining Caleb's complicated role in the events. Now, it seemed, Judgment Day had arrived. Harrington closed the door and sat heavily behind the desk. At 62, he'd been running the reserve for over 15 years with the efficiency and warmth of a military drill sergeant. "I've reviewed all the reports," Harrington began without preamble. Yours, Dr. Reynolds, the statements from the poachers, and your nephew's full confession. He tapped a thick folder on his desk. It's quite a story. Mason remained silent, waiting. Your nephew participated in illegal poaching activities on federal land, Harrington continued. He facilitated access for known criminals, helped set illegal traps, and concealed evidence. By rights, he should be facing federal charges alongside the others. He also risked his life to help capture those same criminals, Mason pointed out. Without Caleb's assistance, we might never have caught them. Harrington held up a hand. I'm aware. I'm also aware that he's your sister's son, that he got himself into gambling debt, and that this was his first offense. The director sighed, rubbing his temples. The DA has agreed to offer him a deal. Full cooperation in the case against the poaching ring in exchange for probation and community service. No jail time. Relief washed over Mason. Thank you, sir. Don't thank me. The decision wasn't mine. Harrington fixed Mason with a hard stare. But his future employment here is my decision. And that's where things get complicated. Mason tensed again. Sir, your nephew violated every principle this reserve stands for. Harrington's voice was flat. And yet, when the moment came, he chose to do the right thing at considerable personal risk. He drummed his fingers on the desk. What would you do in my position, Blackwood? The question caught Mason off guard. In 15 years, Harrington had never asked for his opinion on personnel matters. I'd give him a second chance, Mason said after a moment, under strict supervision with clear consequences if he steps out of line again. Harrington nodded slowly. That's what I was thinking. Probationary status, regular check-ins, mandatory financial counseling, and he works exclusively with the rehabilitation team for a year. No field work, no access to sensitive areas. He'll accept that gladly, Mason said, knowing his nephew would be grateful for any opportunity to make amends. Good. Harrington shuffled some papers. Now, about this bull and cow. Titan and Bell, Mason supplied. Harrington raised an eyebrow at the names, but continued. Their status is another complicated matter. They're technically wild animals, but after all this, he waved vaguely at the folder, they can't simply be released back onto the General Reserve. Why not? Mason challenged. They've proven they can survive. The bull has become too comfortable around humans, Harrington countered, and the cow and calf will need ongoing medical monitoring. Plus, there's the matter of the public interest. Mason frowned. What public interest? Word has gotten out, Blackwood. A bull saving a ranger? A dramatic birth during a storm? The local press has already run stories, and the national outlets are picking it up. Harrington looked pained. We've received donation offers specifically for the hero bull and his family. Mason hadn't considered this angle. So what are you proposing? A designated observation area within the reserve, protected status for all 3 animals, regular medical checks, educational programs about Brahman cattle, and anti-poaching efforts. Harrington actually smiled slightly. Headquarters loves the PR angle, and the additional funding won't hurt. It was a better outcome than Mason had dared hope for. Titan, Bell, and Star would remain together, protected from poachers and other threats, yet still living essentially free. There's one more thing, Harrington added, his expression turning serious again. The bull, Titan, seems to have formed an unusual attachment to you. Dr. Reynolds suggests that for the transition to this new arrangement, you should be the primary handler. Mason nodded, unexpected emotion tightening his throat. I'd be honored, sir. As Mason left Harrington's office, he found Caleb waiting anxiously in the hallway. His nephew's face was drawn with stress, the past day's events weighing heavily on him. What did he say? Caleb asked immediately. Am I going to jail? Mason shook his head. Probation and community service if you cooperate fully with the investigation. Relief flooded Caleb's face, followed quickly by shame. I don't deserve that much leniency. No, you don't, Mason agreed, his tone gentle but firm. But second chances aren't about what we deserve. They're about what we do with them. He put a hand on his nephew's shoulder. Harrington's offering you conditional reemployment, rehabilitation team, no field work, mandatory counseling. Tears welled in Caleb's eyes. After everything I did? After everything you did to make it right, Mason corrected. The question is, what will you do now? Caleb straightened his shoulders, wiping his eyes with the back of his hand. Whatever it takes to earn back trust, to make you and Mom proud again. Mason nodded, satisfied. That's a start. He gestured toward the veterinary center. Want to see how Belle and Star are doing? Together they walked back to the observation window. Inside, Belle had risen to her feet, moving carefully but steadily as she guided her calf around the stall. Dr. Reynolds and a technician were replacing the bandages on Belle's healing wounds, talking softly to keep the animals calm. I still can't believe I almost helped kill them, Caleb said quietly. For money. We all make mistakes, Mason replied. The measure of a person is what they do afterward. Before Caleb could respond, one of the technicians approached them. Mr. Blackwood, Dr. Reynolds asked if you could come in. Belle's getting agitated with the treatment, and she seems to respond better when you're present. Mason nodded, donning a clean coverall before entering the stall. Belle immediately turned toward him, her large dark eyes watching him carefully as he approached. The massive cow had lost weight during her ordeal, but her coat was beginning to regain its sheen, and the healing wounds were less angry than before. Easy, girl, Mason said softly. Just a few more bandages, then you're done for the day. To the amazement of the veterinary staff, Belle visibly relaxed at his voice, allowing them to continue their work without protest. Star, emboldened by her mother's calm, approached Mason on wobbly legs, her curiosity overcoming her natural caution. Well, hello there, Mason said, crouching to let the calf investigate him. Star sniffed his outstretched hand, then butted it gently with her head, a gesture so like Titan's that Mason felt his throat tighten with emotion. She's imprinted on you, Dr. Reynolds observed, just like her father did all those years ago. Speaking of her father, Mason said, how's he handling the separation? Ellie gestured toward the adjacent paddock. See for yourself. Through the viewing window in the dividing wall, Mason could see Titan standing alert, watching their every move. When the bull spotted Mason with Star, he gave a soft bellow that the calf immediately answered with her own high-pitched call. We'll move them all to the new habitat once Belle's wounds are fully healed, Ellie explained. Probably another week or two. Harrington fast-tracked the approvals. Mason nodded, stroking Star's soft head as the calf leaned against his leg. I never expected any of this when I followed Titan into the backcountry. Life has a way of surprising us, Ellie replied, her eyes lingering on Mason's face. Sometimes in the most beautiful ways. Later that afternoon, Mason stood in the paddock with Titan, brushing the bull's massive shoulders as the sun began its descent toward the horizon. After initial resistance, the veterinary staff had agreed that direct contact was actually calming for the bull, reducing his anxiety about being separated from Belle and Star. You're going to be something of a celebrity, Mason told Titan, who seemed to be enjoying the grooming. The bull who saved a ranger and led him to his trapped mate. People will come from all over to see you. Titan snorted softly, pressing his great head against Mason's chest in a gesture that had become familiar over the past days. Don't worry, Mason assured him. I won't let them get too close. You'll have your space. You, Belle, and Star. The bull's intelligent eyes met his, and Mason was struck again by the depth of connection he felt with this animal. Not anthropomorphism or projection, as some might claim, but a genuine bond forged through mutual respect and shared experience. "Mason?" Caleb's voice came from the paddock entrance. "Can I join you?" Mason nodded, watching as his nephew entered cautiously, still uncomfortable around Titan after everything that had transpired. "He won't hurt you," Mason assured Caleb. "He knows you helped save them in the end." Caleb approached slowly, his body language conveying his respect and caution. Titan watched him come, neither retreating nor showing aggression. "I've been assigned to the rehabilitation team starting Monday," Caleb said, keeping a respectful distance from the bull. "Dr. Reynolds says I'll be helping with Star's training once they move to the new habitat." "That's good," Mason nodded. "It'll be good for both of you." Caleb hesitated, then continued. "I also called Mom, told her everything." He swallowed hard. "She's disappointed, but said she's proud I'm trying to make it right." "Your mother's a wise woman," Mason said, remembering his sister's strength when her husband had abandoned the family. "She understands that good people sometimes make bad choices." "Like you did after Sarah died?" Caleb asked softly. The question caught Mason off guard. He hadn't spoken about his darkest days to Caleb, though his nephew had been old enough to notice the changes in his uncle. "Yes," Mason admitted. "I made plenty of bad choices then, drinking too much, pushing people away, neglecting my health and my responsibilities." "What changed?" Mason looked at Titan, remembering the day he'd released the young bull back into the wild. "I realized Sarah wouldn't have wanted that for me, that the best way to honor her memory was to live the life she'd want me to have, caring for the land and animals she loved, being there for family." Caleb nodded, his expression thoughtful. "I want to make things right, Uncle Mason. Not just legally, but—" he gestured toward Titan. "With them, with what I almost helped destroy. You'll have that chance," Mason assured him. "Starting with helping prepare their new home." As if understanding they were discussing his future, Titan moved closer to the dividing wall, looking toward Belle and Star in the adjacent stall. The bull's devotion to his family was extraordinary, a reminder that the capacity for love and loyalty existed throughout the natural world, not just in humans. A technician appeared at the paddock entrance. "Mr. Blackwood, we're ready to run the DNA comparison you requested." Mason had asked for one additional test, comparing Titan's DNA not just to Star's to confirm paternity, but to samples from the deceased mother that had been poached 7 years ago. He needed to confirm what he already believed in his heart, that Titan was indeed the orphaned calf he had rescued, returned against all odds to the man who had saved him. "I'll be right there," Mason told the technician. He gave Titan a final pat before following the staff member to the laboratory section. "Doctor?" Reynolds was waiting with the results, her expression unreadable. "We ran the comparison twice to be sure," she said, handing him the report. Mason scanned the document, focusing on the conclusion. 99.97% probability of direct maternal relationship between Subject A, deceased female Brahmin, 2018, and Subject B, adult male Brahmin Titan, present specimen. Confirmation of what he had known instinctively. Titan was indeed the orphaned calf he had raised, the last living connection to those days with Sarah before tragedy struck. "It's him," Mason said quietly, emotion thick in his voice. "He came back." "The odds against this are astronomical," Ellie repeated her earlier assessment. "For him to find you again after 7 years, to lead you to his mate in trouble." She shook her head in wonder. "Science can confirm the relationship, but it can't explain the why or how." "Some things don't need scientific explanation," Mason replied, thinking of Sarah's words from long ago. Animals understand more than we give them credit for. As the sun set over the reserve, casting long shadows across the landscape that had been transformed by the recent storm, Mason found himself standing once more at the observation window. Inside, Belle lay peacefully with Star curled against her side, both sleeping after the day's examinations and treatments. In the adjacent paddock, Titan stood sentinel, his powerful form silhouetted against the fading light. The bull's gaze shifted between his family and Mason, as if assuring himself that all was well with those under his protection. The DNA test had confirmed what Mason already knew in his heart, that life moved in circles, that debts were sometimes repaid in unexpected ways, and that the bonds formed in moments of crisis could last a lifetime. 7 years ago, he had saved an orphaned calf. Now that same bull, grown to magnificent adulthood, had repaid the debt by saving Mason, leading him to Belle, and in the process, helping Mason find his way back to the land of the living after years of merely existing. As darkness fell across the reserve, Mason made a silent promise to Sarah's memory and to the remarkable animals that had changed his life. From this day forward, he would live fully and completely, honoring the second chance he had been given. Just as Titan had returned to save him, Mason would dedicate himself to protecting the bull and his family. A circle completed, a debt repaid in full. 6 months had transformed the eastern section of the reserve. What had once been an undeveloped stretch of Texas backcountry now featured a carefully designed habitat spanning 20 acres, complete with a natural spring, shade structures, and discrete observation points for visitors and researchers. A tasteful sign at the entrance read, "Titan's Territory, home of the hero bull family," alongside educational displays about Brahman cattle and the reserve's anti-poaching efforts. Mason stood on the observation deck, watching as Star, now a sturdy 6-month-old heifer with her father's steel-gray coloring, frolicked in the early morning sunlight. She had grown remarkably fast, her spindly newborn legs replaced by the strong limbs that would eventually support a frame nearly as impressive as her mother's. Belle grazed nearby, her coat gleaming with health, the scars from her ordeal barely visible beneath her white hide. And then there was Titan. The massive bull patrolled the perimeter of their territory with the same vigilance he had shown since their release into the new habitat 3 months earlier. Occasionally, he would pause in his rounds to check on Belle and Star, or to acknowledge Mason's presence with a soft bellow that still sent chills down the ranger's spine. "Quite a sight, isn't it?" Dr. Reynolds said, joining Mason at the railing. In the months since the dramatic rescue and birth, their professional relationship had evolved into something deeper, though neither had rushed to define it. Weekly dinners to discuss the bull's progress had gradually extended into long conversations about life, loss, and second chances. "They're thriving," Mason agreed, smiling as Star attempted to mimic her father's intimidating head toss, achieving something closer to an awkward wobble. "Star's picking up all of Titan's mannerisms." "Imprinting," Ellie nodded, "though she seems equally influenced by you. Notice how she always approaches the observation deck when you arrive?" It was true. Despite being raised entirely by her biological parents, Star had developed an unusual comfort with Mason's presence. On his regular visits to the habitat, she would often approach close enough for him to stroke her head through the safety railings, a behavior that delighted visitors and confounded researchers. "The Blackwood effect," Ellie teased gently. "You have a way with this family." Mason smiled, but said nothing, his thoughts drifting to the changes the past 6 months had brought. The poachers had been convicted, receiving substantial sentences enhanced by federal charges of operating on protected land. Their prosecution had led authorities to a larger trafficking network, resulting in dozens of additional arrests across 3 states. Caleb had completed his community service and continued working with the rehabilitation team, his dedication to making amends evident in every aspect of his work. Under Dr. Reynolds's supervision, he had become particularly skilled with orphaned calves, his patience and gentleness earning him the respect of colleagues who had once viewed him with suspicion. The reserve itself had benefited from the publicity surrounding Titan's story. Donations had increased substantially, allowing for expanded anti-poaching patrols and improved wildlife monitoring systems. Visitor numbers had doubled, with many coming specifically to see the hero bull and his family, leaving with a deeper appreciation for wildlife conservation efforts. For Mason personally, the changes had been more profound but less visible. The weight of grief that had become so familiar after Sarah's death had not disappeared. He knew it never would completely, but it had transformed into something different. A gentle ache rather than a crushing burden, a bittersweet memory rather than an open wound. "Penny for your thoughts?" Ellie asked, breaking his reverie. Mason gestured toward the Bull family. "Just thinking about how much has changed since Titan appeared at my fence line that morning." "For all of us," Ellie agreed. She hesitated, then added, "Director Harrington's retirement announcement yesterday got me thinking, too." The news had surprised the entire staff. After 15 years leading the reserve, Harrington had decided to step down, recommending Mason as his replacement in a move that had shocked no one more than Mason himself. "I haven't accepted yet," Mason reminded her. "It's a big decision." "But you're considering it," Ellie pointed out. "6 months ago, you wouldn't have." She was right. Before Titan's return, Mason had deliberately avoided advancement opportunities, preferring the solitude of remote patrols to the responsibilities of leadership. His self-imposed isolation had been another form of penance, though he hadn't recognized it as such at the time. "I think Sarah would approve," Ellie said softly, "of all of it. The directorship, Titan's family, even us." Mason looked at her, touched by her insight and her gentle acknowledgement of Sarah's continued presence in his life. "I think she would too," he agreed. "She always said I was meant for more than just existing." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a reserve tour group, families with children eagerly pressing against the viewing rails for a glimpse of the famous Bull family. Mason nodded to the guide, a young woman who had recently joined the educational staff. "And here we have Titan, Belle, and their daughter Star," the guide was explaining. "Titan is what we call a hero animal, a wild creature who demonstrates behaviors that help humans in distress. In Titan's case, he led Ranger Blackwood to his injured mate and later helped rescue Ranger Blackwood and another staff member during a dangerous flood." The children stared in awe as Titan raised his massive head, seeming to acknowledge that he was the subject of discussion. One little boy, no more than 5, waved excitedly. "Can he understand us?" the child asked. The guide smiled. "Animals communicate differently than humans do, but they're much more intelligent and aware than people used to believe. Titan seems to have a special bond with Ranger Blackwood, who saved him as a calf many years ago." Mason stepped back, letting the tour continue without his presence becoming a distraction. He and Ellie walked along the elevated pathway that encircled the habitat, their conversation turning to the practicalities of the coming week. Medical checks for the Bull family, a school group visit, plans for expanding the educational programs. As they rounded the far side of the enclosure, Mason spotted a familiar figure at the secondary observation point. Caleb stood watching the bulls, his expression thoughtful. In his arms, he cradled a small cooler that Mason recognized as the type used to transport special feed supplements. "Morning, Caleb," Mason called as they approached. "Early start today?" His nephew turned, smiling. The past months had changed him too. His face more mature, his bearing more confident. The desperate young man caught in a web of gambling debts and bad decisions had been replaced by someone steadier, more purposeful. Dr. Reynolds asked me to bring Star's new mineral supplement, Caleb explained, holding up the cooler. And I wanted to check how she's adjusting to the extended territory. The reserve had recently added 5 acres to the habitat, allowing the bull family more room to roam while maintaining the security features that protected them from potential threats. "She's exploring every inch," Ellie reported, "following her father's example in everything." Caleb nodded, his gaze returning to the bulls. "I've been accepted to the wildlife management program at Texas A&M, he said suddenly. "Starting next fall. Part-time so I can keep working here." "Caleb, that's wonderful news," Ellie exclaimed. Mason felt a surge of pride. "Your mother must be thrilled." "She is," Caleb confirmed. "Said it was about time a Blackwood got a proper education instead of learning everything the hard way in the field." His smile turned wry. "No offense, Uncle Mason." "None taken," Mason chuckled. "She's probably right." As they talked, Star noticed their presence and trotted over, her curiosity evident. The young heifer approached the fence nearest them, focusing particularly on Caleb and the cooler he carried. "Someone knows what time it is," Ellie observed. "She never misses a feeding." Caleb carefully measured the supplement into the specialized feeder attached to the fence. Star immediately began licking at the mixture, her tail swishing with contentment. "I still can't believe how much she's grown," Caleb remarked. "It seems like yesterday she was wobbling around on those spindly newborn legs." "Time moves differently for them," Mason said, watching as Titan approached to check on his daughter. "They live more fully in the present than we do." It was a lesson Mason had taken to heart in recent months. While he would never forget Sarah or the life they had planned together, he had finally allowed himself to build something new: deeper friendships, a tentative romance with Ellie, a strengthened bond with his nephew, and, of course, his unique connection with Titan's family. After completing their morning rounds, the 3 humans made their way back to the main visitor center. The facility had been renovated thanks to the increased funding, now featuring expanded educational displays and a small theater where visitors could watch footage of Titan's remarkable story. "I should get back to the rehabilitation center," Caleb said, checking his watch. "We have 2 new orphaned fawns coming in this morning." As his nephew headed off, Mason turned to Ellie. "I have something I need to do this afternoon," he said. "Something I've been putting off too long. Would you come with me?" She studied his face, understanding dawning in her eyes. "Of course," she said simply. 3 hours later, they stood before a simple granite headstone in the small cemetery on the outskirts of town. "Sarah Elizabeth Blackwood, beloved wife," the inscription read, along with the dates that encompassed her too short life. Beneath her name was a smaller inscription, "And baby Blackwood, a star that shone too briefly." Mason placed a bouquet of wildflowers, the same varieties that had grown around their cabin, at the base of the stone. It was his first visit in nearly 2 years, the pain having been too acute to face directly, but today felt different. "I've been unfair to her memory," Mason said quietly, "keeping it locked away instead of honoring it properly." Ellie stood respectfully nearby, offering her presence without intruding on the moment. "She would have loved Titan's story," Mason continued, a small smile touching his lips, "especially the part about him being a father. She always said he had an old soul, even as a calf." He knelt, brushing some fallen leaves from the headstone. "I think she sent him to me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not literally, but in the way that the universe sometimes brings exactly what we need when we need it most." Standing again, Mason took a deep breath of the crisp autumn air. "I've decided to accept the director position," he said, "both to Sarah's memory and to Ellie. It's time." Ellie smiled, taking his hand. "She would be proud," she said softly. "And so am I." As they walked back to the car, Mason felt a sense of peace that had eluded him for 7 years. Not an ending to his grief, but a transformation of it into something that could coexist with joy, with purpose, with new beginnings. The following morning, Mason arrived at the reserve earlier than usual. The sun was just cresting the eastern hills as he made his way not to the administrative building where his new office awaited, but to Titan's habitat. He needed this moment, this connection, before stepping into his new role. Titan was already at the fence, as if expecting him. The massive bull stood regally in the golden morning light, his scarred face bearing witness to a life of challenges overcome. Behind him, Belle and Star grazed contentedly, secure in their protected home. "Well, old friend," Mason said quietly, "seems we both come a long way from that day I found you beside your mother." Titan lowered his head, pushing gently against the fence separating them. Mason reached through, stroking the broad forehead he had first touched as a frightened calf 7 years earlier. "I'm taking on new responsibilities," Mason continued, feeling no self-consciousness about speaking to the bull. "Less time in the field, more time in meetings, but I'll still be here, watching over your family. That's a promise." Titan snorted softly, his dark eyes fixed on Mason with what could only be described as understanding. Man and bull regarded each other in the quiet morning light, two beings connected by an improbable history of rescue and return, of debt and repayment, of loss and renewal. An old Texas saying came to Mason's mind, something his grandfather used to repeat: "A good man pays his debts, but a wise man knows when the ledger's been balanced." Standing there with Titan, Mason felt the truth of those words in his bones. Their circle was complete. Whatever debt had existed between them had been paid in full, replaced by something rarer and more valuable, a connection that transcended explanation. As Director Blackwood headed toward his new office that morning, his steps were lighter than they had been in years. Behind him, Titan returned to his family, a silent guardian once more. And somewhere, Mason liked to think, Sarah was smiling. In the months and years that followed, visitors to the reserve would often hear the remarkable story of the bull who dragged a ranger into the wild to save his pregnant mate. They would marvel at the photos and video footage, exclaim over Star as she grew into a magnificent heifer, and perhaps leave with a deeper appreciation for the intelligence and emotional lives of the creatures with whom we share this planet. But only Mason knew the full story. How a traumatized, orphaned calf had returned as a powerful protector, how a man trapped in grief had found his way back to life, and how the simplest acts of compassion could ripple outward in ways no one could predict. It was a story not just of rescue, but of recognition, of seeing the spark of something familiar across the divide of species, of acknowledging a debt and honoring it. "The thing about rescue," Mason would tell the school groups who visited the reserve, "is that it goes both ways. Sometimes, in saving another life, we end up saving ourselves." And from his territory nearby, Titan would raise his massive head at the sound of that familiar voice, a living testament to the truth of those words. As we age, life reminds us that second chances come in unexpected forms. Mason's journey from grief to renewal strikes a chord in all of us who faced loss and wondered if joy would ever return. Like Titan, who remembered the kindness shown to him as a vulnerable calf, we too carry the memory of those who've touched our lives, whether it's the spouse we've lost, the retirement that changed our routine, or the family relationships we're trying to repair. Mason's story reminds us that it's never too late to heal. The debt we owe to ourselves is to live fully in the present while honoring our past. As Mason discovered with Titan's family, new connections don't diminish old loves, they expand our capacity for joy. What unexpected titan has appeared in your life, leading you toward healing when you least expected it? Has there been a moment when, like Mason at Sarah's grave, you realize that moving forward honors rather than betrays those you've lost? Please share your stories of second chances in the comments below. Remember, in the words of Mason's grandfather, a good man pays his debts, but a wise man knows when the ledger's been balanced.